welcome to Deep Dive, and this is a very special episode of Deep Dive. I'm so glad you chose to join us today. Whether you are at the gym and listening to this in audio-only format, or whether you are online and watching this through YouTube or wherever you take in your podcasts, I'm glad you're here. It's a special format today. We're doing a Q&A. I've got some friends here with me, Tim and Gabriel and Haley, and they're going to ask me questions about our What Lies Beneath series that we've been in throughout the fall. This What Lies Beneath series is all about looking at what's underneath the surface of our lives, what's going on within our soul that's keeping us from connecting with God and connecting with the people around us. And so we're going to take some extra time and we're going to talk about some questions that they have. This is going to be about a 30-minute format. In fact, we're going to begin to change our format a little bit of Deep Dive going into 2024. Regularly, we're still going to be in the 5 to 10 minute range when we talk about the sermon, but every so often we're going to throw in a bonus episode where we're going to go for longer and ask more questions. Maybe we'll even do a viewer's question one where you can write in and give us a question. But hey, let's jump right into this and let's find out what questions. I think we're going to lead off with Haley today, and she's got a great question for us to start off with.
So in one of the sermons, you talked about embracing grief.
Yeah.
And a lot of people struggle with their faith when they lose a loved one or a family member. So what advice would you give someone if they came to you with that?
For sure. A lot of times the struggle that we have around grief is the unanswered question, why? Right? Why did this happen to the person I love? Or why in life am I going through this disappointment or this letdown with what's going on? And so that's the big question that causes us to not trust Jesus. And so whenever we experience grief, there's always this pivot point where we have a choice. We can turn to Jesus or we can turn away from Jesus in that moment. I have a dear friend of mine named Linda, and she lost the love of her life, a guy named Ed, her husband, for many years, and lost him to pancreatic cancer, which has a very low survivor rate. And Ed struggled with cancer for 3 years throughout all of this. And so it was a long journey of grief. And yet throughout all of this, I watched this couple with amazing just love for each other and love for Jesus in the midst of it. I remember meeting with Ed, and he was just skin and bones, really. And I would go to his house and I would serve communion to him. And he never lost his faith throughout all of this. He always had this question, why? Why him? But in the midst of that why, he continued to turn towards Jesus with that. Ed actually got a prognosis the doctor said to him one day about a year before he passed away, he said, "You're actually cancer-free." Ed was cancer-free. We prayed for this for years, and he's cancer-free. But because of all of the damage that had been done by the treatments and everything like that, he actually didn't recover and passed away. And so it's kind of like, then you have this grief now of like, well, wait a minute, he was healed. Now, God, why did you do this? And I remember having that question and sitting with my friend Linda, and who lost someone even closer to her than Ed was to me. And we were talking about this, and she said, Kirk, as I have been processing my grief, and this was a couple months after Ed had passed away, I came to this place where Jesus said to me, I hold the answer, and do you trust me to hold the answer in the midst of your grief? And so there is this moment of always trusting Jesus. We always want to know why, right? And that's the question that we've been asking for many years. And as long as we're asking that question, it's not a bad question to ask. It's a good question to ask. Why? But a lot of times we don't listen to what Jesus has to say. We don't trust that maybe he holds the answer in all of that. And so in the midst of grief, it's a pivot point, right? It's this point where you get to choose, will I go this way or will I go that way? I love this story, and Pastor Mike referenced Jesus weeping when he preached about grief. John 11 tells the story of Mary and Martha, and their brother dies. And they respond to grief in two very different ways. One hears that Jesus is coming, and they stay at home. The other runs to Jesus in the midst of their grief. Both sisters feel the same way. They're both upset that their brother is dead, but they respond very differently towards Jesus. And so in the midst of grief, even when it's hard, we need to continue to pivot towards Jesus when it doesn't make sense. We were talking before we came on air about this quote that I heard recently, this idea that blind faith doesn't ask questions, but real faith does. With that quote, there's this other part that you don't always get the answers that you want, right? And in grief, often the answers are left unheard. And that's that moment when you get to pivot towards Jesus and say, I'm going to trust that you hold this answer, but I'm going to keep asking the question. And here's what I know about Jesus. James 1:5 is one of my favorite Bible verses. It says, if any of you lack wisdom, let him ask God who gives generously without finding fault. And he gives that wisdom. The reason why I love that verse is because let him ask God who gives generously without finding fault. And I lack a lot of wisdom. And so I ask a lot of times for something. And what that verse tells me is that every time I come to God and I say, God, can you give me this wisdom? And sometimes it's the same thing over and over again because I ask questions and I have questions about faith that I'm waiting for answers on as well. It says that God doesn't say, oh, you again? He actually says, let me help you in this. And so in the midst of grief, what I often will talk with people about is one, God does want to talk with you about your grief. Psalm says that when we cry, that he is closer to us than anyone else. He's so close, the psalmist writes, that he collects every tear that we cry. And so I'll often quote that verse to someone who's in grief, that God is present with you right now. You may not feel like it, but actually he's there. In fact, the grief you're going through right now is so precious to him that he's collecting the tears that you cry. And then the second one is, ask Jesus your questions. He'll answer. It may not be the answer that you like or that you want, but you have this choice. You can either turn away from God or you can turn to God in the midst of that. And faith is about having questions and saying, I'm going to trust God even though I'm not sure what's going on. The other thing that I often talk with people about as they're going through grief is to be sure you're processing the grief. Mike talked a little bit about this when he was doing that. One of the things that I've done to process the grief in my life is I have a grief journal that I'll sit down with once a year, and I'll just begin to list all of the things that are there in my journal. And it's a way for me to process the grief that's in there. And as I remember what's there, I'll begin to ask God questions around that, and then I'll begin to talk with friends about it as well. And the worst type of grief is unprocessed grief, right? It's the grief we feel, but we don't talk about with anybody else. And the reason why that is the worst type of grief is because it blocks us from talking to other people, from connecting with the people around us, whether it's the four of us here, but it also disconnects us from God as well in that grief. And so be sure to, one, pivot towards Jesus. And even when you're angry with him, like he's okay. He's not going to get mad at you if you're angry with him, right? I think sometimes we go through life when we are legitimately scared of God, right? And I mean, the Bible says the fear of God is the beginning of all wisdom, right? It's not being scared. Fear is about recognizing who God is and who I am. That's the fear of God in the Bible. And it's about saying, man, I am so not like God that maybe I shouldn't be close to him. But then at the same time, recognizing his love and leaning back into relationship with him. That's fear of the Lord. But too often we walk through life scared of God, when God is just this loving person who is going to care for you and walk with you through grief. I don't know if that helps or answers any questions.
Yeah.
You can ask a second question to follow up with that if you want to.
It's kind of related,
Yeah.
but a lot of the time when we have family members, especially children we see that are sick, whether it be like cancer, for example, is a big one. What would you say to parents dealing with a child that is very terminally ill, struggling to hold on to their faith?
Yeah, so I have a good friend whose daughter went through this, and 4-year-old daughter, I remember seeing her, and she looked like a baby because she was that small because of the cancer that was going through this. And when you sit with a family or you sit with a friend or even your own family member that is going through this, I mean, it just rips the heart right out of you. And I think in those moments, what do you say? Man, that sucks, right? Legitimately. And there's nothing, even Jesus is grieved when that is happening, right? And there are no, explanations that are going to satisfy us in life, right? We can talk about, all disease is caused by sin, right? Not sin that you committed necessarily, but it's all caused because of sin in the world. That disease is caused by that. That doesn't help someone in the middle of grief, right? That's theologically true, but it's not helpful. And so in the midst of those situations, I commiserate with them. I sit in the midst of their grief. You know, Jesus, if we go back to that story in John 11, right, with Mary and Martha, and they respond to him in two very different ways. Here's what Jesus did, though. He wept. That's how he responded, right? So this is Jesus, right? Jesus knows, you know, he says at the beginning of the chapter, he says to the disciples that the messengers come at the beginning of the chapter, and they say, Lazarus is sick, right? And Jesus waits there 3 more days before he goes. And then he says to the disciples, now we need to go to Bethany. And the disciples like, well, you sure you want to go there? Because that's close to Jerusalem, like it's right over the hill, and there's people there that don't like you. And Jesus says, we need to go there. Lazarus is dead, and we need to go there because you're going to see something special, right? So Jesus knows what's going to happen at the end of chapter 11. But in the midst of the grief, he sits with Mary and Martha, and he weeps. And I think that there is something for us to learn, that in the midst of a sickness where a child is sick, or someone dies unexpectedly, or someone old, like my friend Ed, has cancer and passes away before even still his time, there's a place for us to sit and just to weep and to grieve with the people that are there. And so we do that, but at the same time, you know, there is we don't grieve as people who have no hope. We grieve as people who have hope. And so, you know, helping people just to pivot towards Jesus, right? And to express their anger, to express what they're feeling in the midst of this, and to let them know that Jesus is okay with it, right? And so we sit and we weep. But then Jesus says, so Jesus sits and he weeps with Mary and Martha, and then he says, I am the resurrection and the life. And he promises that there will be life for Lazarus, right? And you see the women begin to change the way that they think. And then Jesus resurrects Lazarus, right? But so I think Jesus models for us in John 11 how to really process the grief that we go through. Sit and weep with people that are weeping. There's a book, Job, in the Old Testament. I don't know if you guys have read this or not. Yeah, it is an interesting book. It is tough. It is. Man, I had to do a whole course on the book, right? And it's tough. But you have these friends who come and they sit with Job in his grief, and what do? They don't weep with Job. They try to tell him what he did wrong that caused all the problem, or why these problems happened in the first place. And these 4 friends are just whack. I mean, they're way out of line in what they did. And so we need to be more like Jesus than the friends of Job. The friends of Job come in with all of these sayings and great feelings and say, you know, trying to not recognize where he's at and weep with him. And Job is full of emotion. And what I love about this is that God accepts all of the emotion that Job has. He's lost his kids. He's lost all of his possessions. And he's sitting there and he's broken, and God is okay with it, right? And so we have to remember that in the midst of whatever grief we face. There's no easy answers for it, right? That's part of life, is there's no easy answers. We do know that there is a resurrection, and we look forward to that. But in this world, it sucks. I don't know. Anyways.
It's a good answer.
How about you, sir?
All right. So, something that I noticed in the discussions with the fellowship or in the small group series that went alongside this sermon series, something I kept noticing that I was wondering about is you keep seeing people who are, like, who witness or provided with evidence of God's miracles, and they still refuse to accept Jesus. And I was wondering what really, like, what's the cause of that? What stops us from, even when we know that, even when we know we have to follow God, what stops us from actually doing so? Is it about power and control over our lives? Is it something else? Is it like trust, or I know it's a broad question, but
No, it's a great question, Gabriel. Thank you. That's a great way to think about it. All of the topics that we talked about, I think they all play into why someone doesn't come to faith in Jesus, or someone turns away and walks away from Jesus, right? At the root, a lot of times we try to identify ourselves by something in our life. And, identity is such a key aspect of why we don't follow Jesus, or why we don't experience faith the way that maybe we see in Scripture, or the way that maybe we hear about someone who lived 50, 60, 100 years ago, right? And a lot of it has to do with identity. Our culture today has created an identity for who we are, what it means to be, for us, Western Canadians, for more specific, what it means to be a St. Albertan, right? What is it? We have an identity as people of as Albertans, of what it means. And so I was on a call today with people from every province, right across, all the way from Montreal, all the way out to Vancouver, okay? And how they answered some of the questions in the discussion that we were having was very much typical for the region of Canada that they were in, right? That's that identity is there. And a lot of times we get our identity so wrapped up in something that we can't see the identity that Jesus offers us, who we really are, right? Because remember, Ephesians says that you are God's masterpiece, created in Christ Jesus to do wonderful things, right? Genesis talks about how we are created in the image of God. And so there's an identity that's greater than the one that you received when you were born. And all of us receive something when we were born as an identity. So I was born in Hamilton, Ontario. So part of my identity as a kid was I cheered for the Ticats, right? But then my family transplants me to Regina, Saskatchewan. Now I'm supposed to cheer for the Rough Riders, right? Well, that didn't happen for some time in life. But there was an aspect that my identity needed to change. And a lot of times we cling to this identity that is not the identity that God has for us. And what does our society say about us? Well, one is that sex is everything. That's actually part of the identity that we have in life, is that our sexuality and our gender, this defines who we are. It's actually not what Jesus says about who we are, right? But it is what our culture says in St. Albert, in Canada. And so sometimes what gets in the way is the identity that we have that keeps us from pursuing Jesus is because, well, my gender and my sexuality, this determines who we are. And if I'm going to follow Jesus, that's going to change what I think about myself, right? And it could be a hurt from the past, right? Lisa talked about inner healing, that sometimes there's wounds that we have. In fact, I said it a few times through this series, is that who you are, your inner self, was formed between the ages of 4 and 9 years old. And if you think about some of the things that went on in those years, that formed who you are and part of your identity. And those things can get in the way of you following God. So there can be wounds. So my story is that between 4 and 9 years old, I moved 5 times in as many years. And that actually impacted who I was, And as I look back, it changed the way that I relate to people. It changed the comfort level that I have with chaos, because when you're moving, there's lots of chaos, right? And there are times when those inner wounds have actually kept me from leaning into who God is. And so sometimes it can be a wound that begins to form your identity, because what happens is that if you have a scar, right? So when I was a kid, I got a scar, and that scar now becomes part of who I am. And it's the same with wounds in our life. And that becomes something of who you are, and it can block you from encountering Jesus in a deep way. So those are just some of the things, but all of those things of what lies beneath actually keep us from intimacy with Jesus. That's really what we were wanting to get at throughout this whole series, is that as you deal with not only the things you do that hurt other people, or the wounds that you've experienced, or the fears that you carry, that as you deal with each of these things, that there's an opportunity to draw closer and deeper intimacy with Jesus. And that's what, we often talk about this line of faith, right? You cross this line of faith and all that. But actually it's a progressive movement. This is what conversion is, right? We are regenerated and made into the image of Jesus. But at the same time, there's appropriation that needs to happen, that we need to actually begin to live more like Jesus. Paul describes us as having the mind of Christ, right? And you get that at the moment you first believe. And yet at the same time, you don't think like Christ at the moment you first believe. It takes years of doing that. And so the same things that keep us from intimacy with Jesus, the wounds, the fears, the grief, the identity issues, are the same things that keep people from encountering Jesus in the first place. Does that make any sense?
Yeah.
Yeah? Any follow-up question for that?
Not at the moment.
Not at the moment? That's a great question. How about you, Tim?
I have a bit of a question attached to that one. I had a question initially connected to Haley's. Wasn't originally connected to hers, but you kind of answered it when you were talking about that kind of stuff. But how do you feel when some people basically try to put themselves above God? I see in the media a lot of Christian churches, and they're Our Mother in Heaven, that kind of thing, and they basically try to put themselves above God. They try to make God in their image. How do you deal with that? How do you react to that? Because it's they lead people astray, and it's I don't know. I think it's not. It's God didn't call us to be our true selves, our inner selves. He called us to be the person he made, right? And I don't know. It's a lot. How do you handle that kind of thing? How do you?
There's a couple questions in there.
Yeah.
That first one there, this idea of putting ourselves above God, I think we do that every day, right? Whenever we look into Scripture and we say, that's not for me, right? That's a time when we actually put ourselves above God. And that's the original sin, right? If you go back to Genesis 3, the original sin is the serpent says to Eve that if you eat this fruit, you won't die. You'll be like God, knowing good and evil, right? And so Adam and Eve, what do they originally want to do? They want to be God, right? That's ultimately what it is. And we still struggle with that every day, right? Whenever we say there is no truth except my truth, that's a moment when we say that we are God. And so I struggle with that too. Anytime when I know what God wants me to do and I decide not to do it, that's a moment where I'm saying, I know more than God and I'm better than God in this moment. And so it's not just the people on TV, it's me, it's us every day where we try to play God in our life, right? And I think, society, and this gets around to the second part of your question, our society kind of says, be the hero of your own story, right? You ever heard that phrase? Oprah's good at saying that phrase, right? And there is some truth, right? It's stop being a victim, get up off the floor, and begin to move forward. That's really what the sentiment is. But when we hear it, be the hero of your own story, actually Jesus is the hero of our story.
Yeah.
Right? Because we actually can't save ourselves. It's Jesus who we need. And so while there's truth in it, there's also a lie in it as well. And so we need to recognize who Jesus is in the midst of it. And it helps us to go forward. And so as we begin to deal with what's going on in our life, we lean into, the Christian life is about realizing how much you need Jesus, right? It starts at the moment when you realize, man, I need Jesus. And every day, it's there, I need Jesus more. There, I need Jesus more. There, I need Jesus more. And so I think as I've journeyed through my Christian life, I just realize I need him more and more and more. And I think if we actually, as Christ followers, began to live like that, I think it would begin to change the idea of people around us, because they would see us, not trying to be God to ourselves or be our best self, right? Or live your best life ever. But actually, we begin to recognize that Jesus is the one who rescues us and leads us into true freedom, right? And that's what we need to show everybody. Not that we're living our best life ever, but that we're actually trusting Jesus in everything, the good and the bad. I remember a number of years ago, there's this guy in my life who for a lot of years, I was praying for and just hoping he would come to know Jesus, just not interested at all, actually antagonistic. So there was a lot of times, a lot of years, we didn't talk about Jesus because it just was like too hard. And then one day they were visiting, him and his wife were visiting me and my wife, and when we were living in Calgary, and our wives went out shopping together and we stayed at home. I think we were watching a football game or a baseball game or something like that. I can't remember exactly. But I remember him turning to me and he said, there's something different about you and Britton, my wife, and your relationship. Because it's different than my relationship with my wife. And he said, what is it that's different? And we began to talk for 3 hours about the difference. And here's what it is in a snapshot, because I talk about this all the time. When I have a young couple come to me and they're going to get married and they say, will you help us figure out how to get married and how to have a great relationship? I say, sure. I said, here's what you need to know about me, is that I'm only married today because of Jesus, okay? Because without Jesus in my life, Britton and I would have split apart a long time ago. And if Britton was sitting here, she would say the same thing. Okay, so I'm not saying anything she has not said to me as well. The reason we are still married for 32 years is because of Jesus, and that is the baseline of my whole story. And so I just began to talk to him about it, right? And he began to recognize how, he was trying to live his best life with his spouse. Okay, but actually he realized that his life that he built with his spouse was nothing like what Britton and I had built over the course of our life. And he wanted what we had instead of what he had with his spouse. And the reason is because of Jesus. And so that's part of what I talk about is, we should live in such a way that we make Jesus so delightful that people say, what do you got? Or what are you on? Right? Yeah. What is it that is so different about your life? And to do that, it's going to have to mean that I change and I realize I'm not God. And I know who is, and I follow everything that he does, even when it doesn't make sense. In the midst of grief, in the midst of struggles and identity and stuff like that, it is about following him in the midst of it. And then I think we'll begin to see the world change, right? Because I think ultimately people are looking to be their own hero in their story, or they're looking to, live their best life ever, right? Isn't that what we want to do in St. Albert? Live our best lives? But without Jesus, there's no hope. Yeah. Any other last questions? Last chance.
I have one more.
You got one more? Oh.
There's just a couple sermons about shame and guilt.
Yeah.
And I know for young adults and even high schoolers, they can struggle with sexual sin and addictions in that realm. What advice would you give someone struggling with that?
Yeah. One of the things that I always have to remind myself, because I battle with shame, even at 52, right? Actually, I'm 53. Even at 53. I'd still like to be 52. It was a good year. So anyways, even at 53, I still battle with shame, right? And I have to remind myself constantly, one, that I'm not defined by my worst day or the thing that I'm least proud of, okay? That doesn't define me. And, you guys are in your 20s. You've racked up some things that you're not proud of, so maybe some regrets, maybe some hurts and all of that. Multiply that a couple times when you get to be my age, really, right? Because you never stop racking that up. And so there's always this moment where we have to recognize, I'm not defined by my worst moment, by the thing that I said, the thing that I did, or the thing that I'm most embarrassed or regret in all of that. That's the first thing. The second thing is that Jesus actually is the one who defines who you are. And Jesus was actually there with you in your worst moment. He was there when you did that thing that you'd never want anybody else to find out about. He was there. And he still accepts you and loves you in that moment. Those are the two things that help me to break free from shame, is to recognize that's not who I am. Maybe in who I was at one point, but it's not who I am today. And that actually Jesus was there and he still chooses to love me and accept me in all of that. There's a lot of shame that can come from sexual sin. There's a lot of shame that can come from assaults or things that have been done to us. There's all sorts of things that can cause us shame. You're not defined by it, right? This is where we go back to Gabriel's question around identity. What defines us is who we are in Christ. And so we can break free of shame when we actually we take our shame to Jesus and we let him have it. And we talk to him about it. The other thing that I have found helpful to break free from shame is that I tell somebody else about my most shameful moment. And there are people in my life who know everything about me, right? And so while you guys may not know everything that I've ever done, there are people that actually do know that, where there's people in my life where I've, with tears, confessed things that I've done. And you know what I found is that when I brought that into the light, see, shame says, don't tell anybody because they won't accept you, right? That's the lie of shame. What I have found in my life is that when I've told somebody, that actually they love me even more and they accept me even. I don't know why that is, right? And so one of the things that I have struggled with throughout my life is just a fear of rejection. And so when I came here to a new church, to a new job, you know, one of the first things that I began to talk with Mike and Lisa about is my fear of rejection, right? Because those are the two people I work the closest with. My wife knows about it, and she will correct me and help me in the midst of that. But I said, you know what, Lisa and Mike, when I'm in a meeting, there's going to be times where this is just like stirring within me and causing me to feel this thing. And so here's what I want you to know about me. And when you see this, help me in this. And so bringing your shame to trusted people, to Jesus and to trusted people, this will help you break free of this shame. I remember the first time I experienced this. I had done something in my teenage years that had haunted me for years afterwards. And I was sat down with my best friend and we were talking and I just felt this prompting to tell him. And I thought, he's not going to respond well to me. He loved me and he cared for me. And all of a sudden the guilt and the shame that had been carrying around for like 5 years was gone like that. And so for, you know, teens or young adults or even old guys like me, I would say when it comes to shame, you know, bring it into the light, right? Because shame loses all its power when just one person knows what you feel shame over. And recognize that you are not that moment and that Jesus was there and he still died on the cross for you and still accepts you. How's that sit with you?
It's a good answer. I like it.
Well, hey guys, this has been fun. I could do this a lot longer with you guys. This has been fun. You had great questions. And thanks for joining us on Deep Dive. If you have any questions for me or for any of these three they've got answers as well. Actually, they're not even answers. You know, all I'm sharing with you is what I've experienced and what I've learned about Jesus. I don't have any answers. All I have is Jesus. And that's just what I wanted to share with you guys tonight. So if you have questions or you have things you want to talk about, leave a message in the comments box below. We'll get back to you. And be sure to subscribe or like this and share it if this has been helpful to you. Maybe it'll be helpful to someone else. Until next time, Deep Dive will be back in January 2024 when we start our new series, Deconstructing Faith. And it's going to be another one full of lots of questions. And I don't know if there'll be any answers, but there'll be lots of questions. Thanks, guys. Take care.